Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Tonight we continue to screen some of the best TV reporting on race and ethnicity, and we'll speak with City Councilman Leroy Comrie, who represents the Queens District where the Saturday morning police shooting took place. But let's begin with this week's video picks. We begin with a clip of Mayor Bloomberg from just before his news conference on the shooting. You've heard the sound bites, I'm sure, about the force being excessive. Well, here's a part you may not have seen, setting up the photo op with Reverend Sharpton and other community leaders. We'll call this getting ready for the picture that he hopes will be worth 1,000 words.
A number of the clergy have to leave. They're going to go and try to meet with the families, and then later on District Attorney Brown is having a meeting with a lot of the clergy and elected officials, but I just wanted everybody to get their picture and understand we've just met together, and I'll describe the meeting after those that have to go leave.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Point and click, point and click, point and click. Now everyone can debate whether the mayor went too far or not far enough in denouncing the shooting. Another history-making TV moment this week, NBC News has announced that it will now officially refer to the situation in Iraq as a civil war. Matt Lauer announced it on Monday's Today Show.
For months now, the White House has rejected claims that the situation in Iraq has deteriorated into civil war, and for the most part, news organizations like NBC have hesitated to characterize it as such. But after careful consideration, NBC News has decided a change in terminology is warranted, that the situation in Iraq with armed militarized factions fighting for their own political agendas can now be characterized as civil war.
Oddly enough, all the web video clips of this that we saw had the last word somewhat chopped off. Was it really that hard to say? President Bush, for his part, says this is no civil war. It's al-Qaeda trying to destabilize a young democracy by fomenting sectarian violence. Of course, what's another term for all-out sectarian violence? I won't try to say it. But as if worrying about one you-know-what isn't enough, King Abdullah of Jordan went on ABC this week on Sunday to warn that the region may be blowing up into not one, not two. Let's watch.
We're juggling with the strong potential of 3 civil wars in the region, whether it's the Palestinians, that of Lebanon, or of Iraq. I hope that my discussions, at least with the President, will be to provide whatever we can do for the Iraqi people, but at the same time we do want to concentrate ourselves on the core issues which we believe are the Palestinians and the Palestinian peace process, because that is a must today, as well as the tremendous concern we've had over the past several days of what's happening in Lebanon. And we can possibly imagine going into 2007 and having 3 civil wars on our hands, and therefore it is time that we really take a strong step forward as part of the international community and make sure we avert the Middle East from a tremendous crisis that I fear and I see could possibly happen in 2007.
Clip 4. You know that former Russian spy who died of radiation poisoning, and on his deathbed he accused Vladimir Putin of doing it? That's the part you probably know about Alexander Litvinenko. What you may not know is that a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya was also murdered recently, gunned down last month outside a Moscow apartment building. Here is footage of the former spy, Mr. Litvinenko, before he got sick, commenting on the journalist's murder.
Здесь прозвучал прямой вопрос, кто убил Аню.
Somebody has asked you directly, who is guilty of Anna's death? Who has killed her?
Я даю прямой ответ. Аню убил господин Путин, президент Российской Федерации.
And I can directly answer you. It is Mr. Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, who's killed her.
Почему я так считаю? Я назову факты, а выводы вы сделаете сами.
And I can tell you the facts, and you can make your own conclusions.
That was Mr. Litvinenko in October. Here is Mr. Litvinenko just a few weeks later. And those are our video picks for this week. Now, before we really dive into the issues involved in this Queens shooting, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the humanity of the people involved, whether this was a crime or just a horrible tragedy. Sean Bell is lost forever, a 23-year-old who was about to do the right thing and marry his girlfriend, with whom he had 2 children. It's too easy for the media, even the honest media, to just get lost in the issues and the information and forget that a real flesh and blood human being has been killed and is gone. And Joseph Guzman shot 11 times. 11 times. It's hard to imagine. And the police officers involved, they are not physically hurt, but I'm sure most or all of them are suffering deeply right now for having shot up 3 innocent young men, even if those officers wind up deserving jail for criminally negligent homicide or whatever it might be. No one so far is accusing them of setting out to hurt any innocent people or acting out of intentional racism, so I just want to acknowledge the humanity of everyone involved, but especially those who got hurt or killed, no matter how we eventually learn that it happened. My sympathies to anyone tonight watching who knows anyone personally affected. Joining me now is City Councilman Lehrer Show, who represents the nearby area. Councilman, welcome to the program. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
In that clip of the mayor with the photo op that we played, you were in that group, you were in that shot.
I was in the group. I was just outside of that shot.
Just outside the narrow lens shot.
Right.
Did the mayor get what he was looking for? Was that a kind of fakey scene, or was there real unity among all of you?
I don't know that the mayor was looking for anything other than to establish a precedent and a tone with the group that he is willing to listen, that he is willing to hear what their concerns are, that he understands that this shooting is something that he has to take full responsibility for what happened. He has to use his mayoral authority and autonomy to deal with all of the issues around it. And he had a 2-hour meeting before that photo op, quote unquote, where he talked to members of the clergy and elected officials about many issues around police behavior, prior deaths, police practices, the temperature and the climate in the city regarding this issue and many other problems that people have with police.
So when he said in that clip he wanted to make sure that the photo got taken and people see you all together, you think that wasn't just a public relations stunt? You think he's really concerned in the way you just described?
I think he's concerned. I think that what he said there was more for the media. There were, if you saw the New York Times, there were other pictures. New York Times had a different picture of him and Sharpton actually shaking hands with a group of us around him. There have been other opportunities for media. I think that he was trying to be respectful of the fact that Reverend Sharpton had to leave, because Reverend Sharpton had been meeting with him from 10:30 that morning. That photo op, I think, happened at around 12:45, and he did have to get back to the families.
We open up the phones on this segment, hopefully for your solution-oriented comments. Folks, what do you think needs to change for an incident like this not to happen again? Call us and tell us what you think needs to change. 212-251-0801, 251-0801. A number of policies, police policies that were not known prior to this incident have come to light. Maybe it's one of those. Maybe it's something even deeper and more underlying. What do you think needs to change to prevent an incident like this from ever happening again? 212-251-0801 for City Councilman Lehrer Show tonight. The Club Kalu, is in your district, right?
Yes, unfortunately it is.
And from what I've read, it's a long-time trouble spot, and the undercover cops who were there that night were trying to document one more violation to meet the criteria to shut it down. Is that your understanding as well?
That's my understanding. That's why they were there. The club has not been there for that long a period of time. It's only been there for about 3 years. But since it's opened, it's been a problem. It's come up in community council meetings. The community has wanted it shut down. It was shut down for a period of time and then reopened, and the police were there actively trying to develop the next complaint to have it shut down again.
So is there a policy issue there? Is there some way that it should have been or could be in the future easier to go after a trouble spot like that without these undercover, guns in the car kind of police situations?
Well, as you know, I'm the chair of the Consumer Affairs Committee, and we're looking at nightlife in general in the city and how police should behave in and out of clubs. And there are a lot of issues around police tactics and behaviors in clubs, whether or not they should be even allowed in clubs on duty or off duty. There's a lot of problems with how police treat people in the city when they're coming out of venues. The club owners have been consistently asking for uniform presence in the club, not in the club, but on the street. So if you can have a uniform presence on the street in front of the club, not going inside and having drinks, not participating inside the facility at all, they're willing to do paid detail, which is something that they've been talking about for a while.
What does paid detail mean? Paid
detail would be, as they're doing for Shea Stadium or Madison Square Garden, where the police are at the facility.
They're hired privately.
They're hired
while they're off duty.
They're hired on duty.
On duty.
The stadium or in the garden pay the police department for the privilege of having them on duty in uniform at the facility.
So you think a small neighborhood club should be required to fork over to the city like that?
The Nightlife Association is willing to pay for paid detail for the major club areas, the Chelsea area, the West Side area. They're willing to spend that money because the nightclub industry actually has more visitors than the stadiums. Actually, they have more visitors in a week than a stadium has at one event. So you have a lot of traffic moving in the city at night, and that's part of the ambiance of this city. So, and that's part of the economic development of the city. It's money that we cannot lose, actually, in a city that's becoming less Wall Street dependent. And we need to make sure that those things that make this city the best city in the world can be enhanced. And I think that paid detail is a necessary.
And yet, without making some clubs drug spots, gun spots that endanger the community.
I think a paid detail, if they could have uniform officers in front of a club, then even clubs that are seedy or not first-class clubs that feel that they have a problem can have a uniform in front. Takes a lot of that away, because then people would not want to congregate in front of the club. They would not want to deal with illegal activities in front of the club, and you would see a lot less of the rancor that you see outside the environment.
Interesting. What's your local police precinct?
I have the privilege of having 3 precincts. The biggest precinct in my district is the 113th. The 103rd precinct is where this club was. The 105th precinct represents the eastern end of my district.
And how would you describe police-community relations, especially with the 103rd, prior to this incident?
There are 2 levels of police-community relations in my district, and probably it's the same throughout many districts. The police have been working as hard as they can on one level to do outreach to civic associations, community boards, block associations. They're trying to reach out to churches to have better community relations. But it's the police captain, the community affairs officer, maybe a sergeant, and 2 other people. It's not the man on the street. There are only a few police captains that actually bring the police officer with them to community meetings. They had started it for a while, but it stopped. There's a disconnect, though, because they're not reaching the young people. They're not reaching people other than the regular community people that are concerned about having a safe and secure community. So they're going to community meetings where they're being told, we want more police, we don't want to see loitering, we don't want to see people walking in the street, we want to have more police and feel safe. But then they're not doing enough outreach, I think, to schools. They're not, because of the problems with the Board of Ed and access, they're not able to reach out to young groups because it's very hard to identify those youth groups or youth alliances that the police can talk to. So there's a lot of things that we need to do to create that interaction. They're not talking to young people that are on the street other than in hostile, confrontational situations, other than in conversational opportunities.
So here's a quote that I got out of one of the papers. This is from Bishop Lester Williams, who was scheduled to perform Sean Bell's wedding on Saturday. Williams said the shooting revealed a, quote, grave crisis between the police and the black community in southeastern Queens. He said, quote, it's little Iraq. We don't feel protected. Does it feel like little Iraq to you?
To me personally, no. To young people and many young people around the community, yes. And I frankly have to say yes, because I've had many ministers that have come to me about their parishioners that have been walking from school. Jamaica Avenue in my district normally has a traffic flow of about 7,000 young people during the afternoon and morning rush hours. I have people that are concerned about how they're being treated while they're walking. I have young people that are concerned about being pulled over. Since there was an incident in my district in the 105th precinct about a year and a half ago where a police officer alleged that someone shot him. He was shot in the foot along Laurelton Parkway. They never found the perpetrator. Later that day, they rounded up over 200 people. Every black person that was over 6 feet tall, whether you were 12 years old or 50 years old, had been rounded up and taken to the 105th precinct.
So it's a double-edged sword. And when Bishop Williams says we don't feel protected, and you tell me that story, it sounds like, A, they don't feel protected enough by the police from thugs, and B, they don't feel protected enough from police harassment.
Right. So it's a double-edged story. You know, clearly we want to have safe communities, but we want to have proper police procedures.
Can the police ramp up the aggressiveness to protect the kids from criminals out there without going over a perceived line of harassment?
I would say that they need to ramp up their professionalism and decrease their aggressiveness. There's a difference between me coming up to you and saying, "Young man, what are you doing here?" as opposed to me coming up to you, throwing you down on the street, or grabbing you by the neck, or pushing you against the ground, and treating you and dehumanizing you in the process. And unfortunately, there's too much of the latter going on and not enough of the former. Courtesy and professionalism and respect has been...
That's the police official motto.
The police official motto has been minimized since 9/11, especially since this incident that I told you about.
You think since 9/11? Because there is an argument out there that 9/11 happened at the end of the Giuliani administration. The Giuliani administration had pretty bad police-community relations, but under Mayor Bloomberg and Ray Kelly, it's been a lot better. Is that not your experience in your district?
Again, there's two levels of police-community relations. There's the police-community relations between communities that want the homeowners or citizens that want police in their communities. The statistics of crime require that police are in certain communities, but the behavior of the police in those communities, with even with the class of criminals or with the class of walkers, the class of people that are driving. I can tell you a story of a young man I know that's a executive for a hotel company for Starwood Hotels chain. He works in Westchester, driving in his BMW, coming home, stopped in Harlem to drop a friend off, had a busted taillight. He wound up being held up by the police for over 24 hours. Totally professional, did not have a problem, did not know that his driver's license had expired because he changed addresses recently.
And for people elsewhere in the city who aren't familiar with that neighborhood, I know I've ridden around with you in your car touring the district. It's a very middle-class neighborhood, or at least a lot of it is.
Correct. And you know, it's a middle-class neighborhood with middle-class values. With I can tell you that Councilmember Gallagher talked about doing a loitering bill a la Cincinnati and some other cities. I was amazed that most of the homeowners in my district would like to see a loitering bill. They'd like to see a bill that would mandate young people being off the street.
And might crack down on their own kids.
And they want their own kids to be off the street after 11 o'clock at night. I was surprised at the reaction from my own community about the loitering bill because I initially was against it. Now I have to help Councilmember Gallagher with trying to reshape it so that it could work.
Let's take a phone call. Chandra in the Bronx, you're on the air. Chandra, thanks for calling.
Yes, good evening, and your guest.
Good evening.
Okay, you asked for solutions. A lot of these things, we say race. I think race does play a big part of it, but I worked for the Transit Authority, and I learned sometimes it's not the color of the cop, it's the mentality. And I feel that ongoing psychological testing is a must in training. Number two, I do believe that the blue wall of silence should be dealt with. Because if they tell us that it's only 5% of the police that act up, it seems to me that the 95% of good cops should be required, and out of good conscience or whatever, say, well, we're not going to have you tarnishing our image. And the third thing I'd like to say is that 48-hour rule got to go.
Chandra, thank you very much for all those suggestions. And the 48-hour rule is what protects police officers suspected of untoward behavior from being interviewed by police community affairs or police internal affairs for 48 hours. Although my understanding is in this case, the police department decided not to interview them at all so as not to risk any potential prosecution by the DA.
No, not to give them immunity against prosecution by the DA. But the 48-hour rule was technically removed by the police department in the last contract. But in effect and in reality, it's still in play. But in this particular case, the police department decided that they would allow the district attorney, or actually the district attorney asked the police department to be the first person to interview the police officers so that they would not have immunity.
Chandra talked about the 5% who may be bad apples, but the 95% are quiet on their behalf and don't tell what they really saw in an incident. Do you have any sense that in this case there were some so-called rogue cops involved, people who were bad apples? We haven't heard anything that I know of indicating that they have bad records.
It's too early to make those kind of rationalizations or understandings. But I think that she is right to try to work on the blue wall of science. But I think in this particular incident, clearly an undercover that's inside the club should never be able to come outside and make an arrest. You don't know. Clearly an undercover that's inside the club should have a breathalyzer or a urine analysis as opposed to a visual, whether or not you're drunk or not.
Because there was a supervisor on the scene who just eyeballed the cops who came out of the club. They're allowed to have 2 drinks while they're in the club so they can maintain their cover. But then they were just eyeballed and said, okay, you're fit for duty. You want something more objective than that.
Clearly, there's another problem. The undercover officers were not just driving unmarked cars. They were driving rental cars. So
why is that a problem?
That's a problem because the gentlemen that were exiting the club, you don't know if a van that has no police lights is a police vehicle. And anybody could put a little red light on a vehicle. So I think that having rental cars,
if it's a cop or
you don't know if it's a cop
thug
or a thug
posing
as a cop.
Which is, according to one version of events, exactly what Sean Bell thought was going on.
The police that were outside on the street were not marked in clear uniforms. Even undercover cops, once they're outside on the street, I mean, the undercover cop inside can be undercover in plain clothes, but the rest of the squad should have been in bright colors with NYPD emblazoned on them so that there would be no doubt that you're being approached by a police officer.
Here is another clip of the mayor. Here's the question. Is he setting the right tone here or trying to have it both ways?
I can tell you that it is, to me, unacceptable or inexplicable how you can have 50-odd shots fired, but that's up for the investigation to find out what really happened.
So is the mayor setting the right tone there, or is he having it both ways, saying it seemed excessive, but he's going to wait for the investigation?
I think the mayor is trying to not supersede his police commissioner's autonomy, not try to pre-dictate not try to make any suppositions beyond what his emotional feelings are to the issue.
And that's appropriate,
and that's
according
appropriate.
to you.
I think, you know, if he says that it seems excessive, everybody that I've talked to believes that 50 shots is just excessive. So he's not articulating anything that the average citizen doesn't feel.
Because I get some calls on the radio show from African-American listeners who say, we're tired of the measured response. We're tired of let's wait and see where the evidence leads. We're outraged. We want white people in this city, starting with the mayor, to say, look, another innocent black man, 3 in this case, have been shot for no good reason. We want to see outrage on the part of the white community. Do you feel that way?
I've already been given expressions of support and expressions of assistance from many people from all across the color spectrum. White legislators, Councilmember Brewer, Councilmember Jimmy Otto, Councilmember Dennis Gallagher, Councilmember Bill de Blasio, Lou Fidler,
So you're saying white folks from all the boroughs and both parties.
Right. And it's a clear consensus. We had a Democratic caucus meeting on Monday, and across the board, every council member in the room, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all have endemic problems with police practices.
Let's take another call. Paul on the east side, you're on the air. Thank you for calling, Paul. Paul, are you there?
My comment was that I don't see much activity from Jesse Jackson or from Reverend Sharpton to stop the influx of weaponry on the streets of New York City, and I don't see much effort by much of the leadership of the black community to stop the weaponry. That's what triggered this entire thing. It was a fearful weapon. And I'd also like to comment that if a vehicle is coming towards you and you have no way of stopping it, you fire on it until it stops. And if that takes 50 shots, fine. If that takes 100 shots, fine. You stop the vehicle.
Paul, thank you for your call. And that's another policy that has come to light.
But that's not police policy, what he articulated.
No, the opposite is police policy.
Correct.
They are not allowed to fire their weapons. And this isn't true everywhere. I got a call from a cop in New Jersey the other day who said, you know, we're allowed to fire on a vehicle if the vehicle is being used as a weapon. In New York, you're not allowed to fire on a vehicle if the vehicle is the only weapon. They also have to have a firearm or something.
Right.
Does that make any sense?
It needs to be looked at. I think that it makes sense that if you're a police officer, you should be firing from a safe position that the vehicle should not hit you. If you're in a car and a vehicle hits you, then you have to make sure that you're not being fired upon. Being hit, a car hitting another car is not endangering your personal being. If that collision was a head-on collision, that was reported in the papers. The other car was hit on the side. I don't see the reason for 50 shots being fired in such rapid succession without somebody really understanding what the elements were in that situation. I think that clearly the officer panicked and just unloaded until he thought that whoever was in that car was not going to respond.
And what about Paul's other point that some of the protest or advocacy leaders from outside the district don't speak out about guns?
This city council has done more about gun control and gun legislation. Mayor Bloomberg has been one of the leaders in trying to stem the illegal gun flow.
He talked about Reverend Sharpton.
I'm not going to
Jackson.
even deal with that. I don't consider that a relative comment. Reverend Jackson and Sharpton have been advocates in trying to stem violence. They're not supermen. We need to do this not just from one person. The entire community has to deal with that issue. We have to make sure that our young people are employed so that they're not taking up illegal weaponry. We have to work on educational issues so that they're not looking for shortcuts. To say that we ourselves are going to get rid of illegal guns is like saying that the earth is really pink and the sky is really black.
You're an elected official from the neighborhood, and yet it is Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Jackson, Councilman Barron from outside the neighborhood who seem to get most of the TV time as spokespeople for the victims and for the communities of color in the city. Is that right as far as you're concerned? You know that they're lightning rods and they get a lot of people ticked off and they think that these guys are, you know, rabble-rousers. What do you think? What do you think is their proper role in incidents like this in your community?
People have history with Reverend Sharpton, and I think that, you know, the family reached out to Reverend Sharpton because he has a history of dealing and being a straight talker. Charles Barron is a person that feels that any time that there's an issue that he has the right to come into a community. I'm not going to get into, you know, that. I'm going to do my best as a legislator in my district to help my community. I'm not worried about them getting more media attention. Reverend Sharpton has been dealing with this for the better part of 30 years. He has a reputation and people will call him. his numbers published. The families, one of the families actually have been working with him in the National Action Network, so people reached out to him. I'm going to do my best as a legislator. People feel comfortable reaching out to me on situations, and they have. I get calls on a regular basis from mothers that their sons were arrested or they're in jail, and I help process them through that paperwork. I'm getting calls from constituents all the time about issues regarding police conduct. So it's not that I'm looking to keep them out of my community. I'm working with them on this particular situation, and I'm actually trying to make sure that we keep the community calm and focused on best practices and changes other than just anger and frustration.
What do you think will happen in your community if there is not an indictment or a conviction in this case?
The temperature of the community will be up. People will be totally agitated and upset. People will have to understand, have to try to comprehend the incomprehensible. And you know, the reality is convictions in these types of cases are difficult to get.
Is it a crime? We're almost out of time, but is it, in your opinion, from what you know so far, a crime or a tragedy?
Both. I think it's a tragedy that this crime happened.
What makes it a crime?
I think that what happened was a result of poor police procedures, poor police practices, a police officer that got out of control in a situation that he should have controlled.
What's the crime?
50 shots being fired without any consideration.
What's the charge? Criminally negligent homicide?
I'm not a lawyer, but whatever the maximum charges for this incident should be given to the police officer.
City Councilman Lehrer Show, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up in a minute, we continue to screen some of the best TV reporting on race and ethnicity. This week's story is about an illegal immigrant from Guatemala who not only snuck into the country, but into the U.S. military and was sent to Iraq. Stay with us for that. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
Prominent professors, outstanding students, illustrious alumni, all on the Emmy-nominated magazine show about CUNY. Hi, I'm Diana Ravinka. Join us every week as we bring you stories about the people and programs that make CUNY a place where you study with the best.
This is Brian Lehrer Live. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30. Now we continue to screen some of the best TV reporting on race and ethnicity. This week's story is about an illegal immigrant from Guatemala who not only snuck into the country, but into the U.S. military and got sent to Iraq. This story originally aired on 60 Minutes on CBS and has now been included in the book and DVD called The Authentic Voice, The Best Reporting on Race and Ethnicity, compiled by the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and the Poynter Institute for Excellence in Journalism. It's published by the Columbia University Press. Joining us is Ernest Sotomayor, Director of Career Services at the Columbia Journalism School. He's the former president of the group Unity, Journalists of Color, and was a reporter for Newsday for 16 years. And we welcome back a co-editor of the Authentic Voice collection, Arlene Otoro Morgan, Associate Dean of Prizes and Programs at the Columbia Journalism School and Director of their Let's Do It Better workshops on journalism, race, and ethnicity. The story is called The Death of Lieutenant Corporal Gutierrez. Here is part of it. The correspondent is CBS's Bob Simon.
He was killed in a tank battle in southern Iraq on March 21st. We can also tell you how his story began. It began here in a slum outside Guatemala City. We can't show you any pictures of Jose, though, at least not when he was a kid here. There are none. Jose was orphaned when he was 6 years old and became a street child. Street children in Guatemala do not get their pictures taken. This is how America will remember Jose Gutierrez, handsome and heroic. But shortly before Bruce Harris met him, he was homeless and helpless, what Latinos call the dust of the earth.
He was really a survivor, and that's how he made it up to the United States, because he was a survivor. ¿Cómo estás?
Bien.
See?
Bruce Harris began running Guatemala's Casa Alianza Orphanage, that's Covenant House in Spanish, shortly after Jose was taken there at the age of 9. Today, Harris directs all their operations in Central America and fights for children so fiercely that Queen Elizabeth invested him into the exclusive Order of the British Empire in his native England.
He wasn't satisfied in trying to etch out subsistence survival in a country like Guatemala, where more than 80% of the people are poor. He wanted more. He knew there was more to life than just being poor.
So in 1997, 12 years after entering the orphanage, Jose said he was leaving for America. It was a 3,000-mile trail of tears, by foot, by tire, by train, a modern-day version of the Underground Railway, and the last leg over the wall. But when Jose made it to the border, he got busted. He was 22 years old and the INS was going to turn him back. But he was saved by his baby face. He told the authorities he was only 16. Minors don't get turned back. He was allowed to stay in America and get a green card.
Once he crossed the border, and he had to lie to get in. You know, some people say, well, that's not very good. I mean, it's not something that we would prefer, but he knew that to survive, if he'd said he was 21, he'd be thrown back with the tens of thousands of wetbacks, a derogatory term used on that side of the border, towards people who want to survive.
Sotomayor, you were an editor at Newsday for 16 years. This is obviously a story about a Guatemalan immigrant. But is it a story about race and ethnicity?
It's partially that, but it's a lot of things. It's a great tale to tell on any level, just about. It's a very human story. It's one that raises issues throughout the course of the story. You could say it's a story about race and ethnicity in our country, certainly.
And Arlene, you included it in this collection of the best reporting on race and ethnicity. What did you like about it?
I saw it as an obituary, actually, because I covered so many of the dead who came back from Vietnam. So I think it appealed to me on that level because I had not been seeing the press do very much about the current Iraq war dead. And so I saw it as both a wonderful obituary, but also a story that is rarely told about how, quote-unquote, illegals are giving back to the country, because most of the time you see stereotypical stories about illegal immigrants and the fears that arise about their being here. So this was a different viewpoint about what an immigrant was doing for America.
And Ernest, just the way it started in Guatemala, started with the kinds of scenes that Americans don't see very much. So rather than him in uniform or him in Iraq, it was the place he grew up, dirt poor in Guatemala.
Yes, I think that's the scene that Americans, in fact, very often see when it comes to Latin America, when it comes to what we see pictured in television news and much of the media when it comes to Latinos and Hispanics and other poor people. That is the scene. I mean, what worked in this story, and there are things that didn't work, but what worked in this story is that you got a good picture of the human being that went across the ocean, served his adopted country, as they say, and paid an ultimate price. And that is, as Arlene said, a tale you just didn't hear very much of. It was early in the war, and people just needed to know that there were people making sacrifices for this nation who weren't fully part of the United States yet.
Very early in the war, he was one of the first casualties in the war, as the story says. Now here's more of the 60 Minutes report, called The Death of Lieutenant Corporal Gutierrez, as included in the Authentic Voice, the best reporting on race and ethnicity.
Jose was one of more than 20 foster children taken in by the Mosqueras, but he became a real brother to the Mosquera daughters, Lillian and Jackie.
Did he change much in the years that he was here?
He became sillier.
That must mean happier.
Yeah. This last New Year's Eve, we all were just up, we were dancing and just having fun. We had a great New Year's. And then we just started playing different CDs, and he loved the Beatles, so we were playing the Beatles, and then Hey Jude came on. And he's sitting there singing Hey Dude. I'm like, Jose, it's not Hey Dude, it's Hey Jude. He's like, no, it's Hey Dude. And by the end of the song, we were all singing Hey Dude. So,
maybe it's Hey Dude.
yeah, you know. But
Jose went to a community college, played soccer there, and then dropped out last year to join the Marines. He was not an unusual recruit. Most Marines are only high school graduates.
I state your full name.
Most are working class. Many are Hispanic. When a green card holder joins the military, he can apply for citizenship after 3 years instead of the usual 5. But Jose told his mother he had other reasons for joining. Other reasons for wanting to go to Iraq and help topple the regime of Saddam Hussein.
Before he was shipped out, he told me I cannot stand having a regime do to women and children what this regime is doing in Iraq. And I'll give my life, if I have to, in order to defend those children. And those are the ideals of the Marines, and those were his ideals, of becoming someone, of being able to help those other children that are not as fortunate as he was.
So sad, really, to think of him and where he came from, and of all the children who need help in the world from poverty or from anything else, and yet somehow he got lit up about the kids who needed protection from Saddam Hussein and wound up getting killed for it.
It's an interesting story, and one that had been told in the Los Angeles Times first. This was a derivative story. They read it in the Los Angeles Times and then decided to go after it for 60 Minutes.
The book says, though, that Bob Simon and his producer challenged the notion that this should be a story about heroism alone. What else did they bring to it that was an important aspect from a journalistic perspective?
I think they really brought the immigrant issue out, because Steve Glauber, who was the producer, is an immigrant, and he said he felt empathy for Gutierrez and what he had to go through to make it. And part of making it was, I guess, to get into the service because he thought it would help him with his education. So, and one of the things that Glauber talked about is what does make a hero? Do you die and then become a hero? Had he lived and come home and had a successful career, would he have been a hero? The Guatemalans apparently didn't think he was such a hero. They thought he was cannon fodder for the U.S. government. And
we'll see a clip about that in a couple of minutes.
So,
but Ernest, you said a minute ago that there were some things about the story that you didn't like. Like what?
Well, one of the points that Arlene raises is that in the United States, 60 Minutes points out he is considered a hero because he served his adopted country. He died, paid the ultimate price again. But in Guatemala, Bruce Harris talked about how Guatemalans did not necessarily think he was a hero and didn't characterize him in the same way. In the piece, Bruce Harris is the person who speaks for the Guatemalan people. I was struck when I saw this piece the first time.
No Guatemalans.
How there were no Guatemalans quoted in this piece. And I found it very odd and very troubling that they would travel to Guatemala talk about a Guatemalan who came here, and that they would depend on someone who was not a Guatemalan to give us the viewpoint of the people who they were surrounded by. Fundamentally, that was a very serious flaw in the story. If you wanted to know about how people who were injured in the war, maimed, and came back wounded for life, you wouldn't go to the VA hospital and ask the nurses in the hospital or the doctors who had not served and weren't wounded. You wouldn't go to the shopping mall and ask
There
the
was
clerks.
one short clip of, I think, his priest, right, with a translator.
Yes.
But
Well, no, not a
he spoke in
translator.
English.
he spoke in English, right.
One of the issues, and I think this is a teaching lesson for this chapter, is that 60 Minutes, more often than not, will not use non-English speakers. They just won't, because they feel that they have an English-speaking audience and that they lose the eyeballs
Americans
when they bring
don't go to
in
movies with subtitles.
Right, right. So they always look for somebody who can speak English. So one of the things that Simon says in the interview that's on the DVD is, why did we need a Guatemalan? We had Bruce Harris. Well, the fact is, if they had had a Guatemalan in the story, they may have had a different story, and it may have come out as an anti-war story. And I think they were so focused on creating a story about the hero of this illegal immigrant that they really chose not to go after that.
I think they raised the issue of whether or not he was a hero, and I think they left it on the table and didn't deal with it, and it sort of tickled the public in a way that I thought was a little unfair.
Well, it's there a little bit in one of the clips we've yet to screen. So here is another one of those clips from the 60 Minutes report called The Death of Lieutenant Corporal Gutierrez, as included in The Authentic Voice, the best reporting on race and ethnicity.
He was one of the first U.S. servicemen to die in combat in Iraq. No death of any soldier goes unmourned, but the death of a man who died for a country that was not his, that proved especially poignant to many Americans, including President Bush, who visited 2 wounded non-citizen soldiers and made them citizens on the spot.
You know, we got an amazing country where it's so powerful, our values, we believe, that people would be willing to risk their own life and become a citizen after being wounded. It's an amazing moment.
Jose was also granted American citizenship posthumously. And that's also when he became a hero.
So, Arlene, do you think there might be some benefit in just using the English speakers if it keeps their audience big and therefore they can get the story out to more people if it's an important story?
I think within the constraints, the time constraints they had, I think they probably at the time made that decision to just keep it there. I also think they were really trying to do a story and focus it on this young man because he was so anti the stereotype. And if they had gotten into the language issues, and I think it would have probably eaten up a lot of time, and as Bob Simon says, they didn't need anybody else to voice it when they had Bruce Harris. And they went in and did this story in 5 days, the whole story in 5 days, and got it on the air. So they really rushed this. I mean, that's not the 60 Minutes way. They usually spend a great deal more time
Why
doing
different
stories.
in this case?
I think because he was the first immigrant killed in Iraq and only the second person killed in Iraq.
They wanted to get it on that
They
week.
wanted to get it on pretty quickly.
Newsy.
And also remember, the administration was trying to downplay who was being killed. And they didn't really want publicity. So 60 Minutes probably saw it as their duty to get it on the air as quickly as possible.
Ernest, as you mentioned, this story was reported pretty widely, not just by CBS 60 Minutes, first in the Los Angeles Times. I wonder if you happen to see it in any Spanish language media and whether it was covered differently there.
This particular story?
Yes.
No.
I actually have not seen very much coming out of the ethnic press on the coverage of the war dead. It may be there, but I'm not reading it, and it hasn't come to our attention that much now. I would really love to see what they've been doing with the war.
I learned from this, by the way, that minors don't get turned back at the border if they can prove that they're minors. That's something that I hadn't known before. It's an interesting...
Well, you actually learn a lot about Gutierrez because he certainly was crafty enough to know that and to get into the country and to get adopted by a family in Los Angeles and really start a new life. That took a lot for a kid who really grew up in an orphanage and did come from poverty. So you wished you had really known him because he was a remarkable young man.
Yeah.
And I think that's the story Bob was trying to tell. This was a remarkable young man. They also said they're not out there to educate people. They're there to tell a good story. And that's the story they wanted to tell.
Well, that's such an interesting tension in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Are you, as a journalist, out there to educate the public? You've been a working journalist. Were you out there to educate the public, or were you just out there to tell a good story?
I've actually always felt that I was part educator when I was telling stories and when I was a reporter. And I was a reporter in Chester, Pennsylvania during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And so I actually did feel that I was educating the Philadelphia Inquirer audience about this city and what it was going through during that period. But other journalists don't. Other journalists say they're just storytellers. It's not their job.
How about you, Ernest?
You know, at the core of what we do every day is educate people, whether or not that is what our stated goal is. We do.
Is there a difference between educate and inform? Because some people might hear educate and think, oh, well, they're trying to preach to me their own point of view.
Well, you can throw up messages on the chalkboard with block letters and say, this is the way you educate, or you can tell a story like Corporal Gutierrez and bring up issues about immigration and how they were coming into the country and how they're getting into our military and serving and dying. But you can't get around the fact that you are educating people, but you also educate them by what you don't tell them. And you have to just be cognizant of what you're not putting on the air as well as what you're putting on the air, because you can educate by both
omission.
methods, by omission.
Yeah. Well, here's one more clip of the 60 Minutes report called The Death of Lieutenant Corporal Gutierrez, as included in The Authentic Voice, the best reporting on race and ethnicity.
An American hero, but in Guatemala, a little more complicated. He wanted to be buried here, that's what he told his family. It was, after all, his home. The Marines came down to give him a proper military farewell. But there were hardly any Guatemalans at the ceremony. After all, officials said, he didn't die for Guatemala. But Bruce Harris mourned him. He's the guy who lifted him off the streets nearly 25 years ago.
Bruce, the States know Gutierrez is treated as a hero. How has it played here in Guatemala?
One group felt that these young Hispanic men were being sent as cannon fodder into the battlefield, because at first many of the U.S. Marines who were killed were Latinos, and that created a big question here. Are young Hispanic men who go up to the United States looking for a future, for an education, are they being sent to the front because they're dispensable?
You're saying that in Guatemala he was viewed more as a victim than as a hero?
I would say a bit of both, and it's always a very difficult situation. I mean, we've looked at how we use the terminology. Having been for years the throwaway kid, the rubbish of society, who are we now to question that he should be called a hero after living so many years as a nothing? But it's a high price to pay for a title.
The U.S. government bought Gutierrez a plot in Guatemala's ritziest cemetery, probably making him the first kid from the slums ever buried here. But this is where Harris wanted him buried, in a plot reserved for Casa Alianza kids, the street children of which he was one. Another neighborhood, another kind of cemetery.
And so we have a plaque for him in memory of who loved life, Jose Antonio Gutierrez. It was important to be here. This is his home.
So there's another tension that gets raised in the piece, not explored all that much, but where he would be buried, and the symbolism and the meaning to Guatemalans of where he would be buried. Think they handle that well?
It's a mystery, because in the same way that they had Mr. Harris speaking for the Guatemalans, they really didn't have anybody at all speaking to that issue other than him. So, again, I understand all the constraints they are under in terms of time and their desire to have an English-speaking audience see the story all in English. But fundamentally, to me, you've got to play this out in all fairness angles, and you want to get to the source, the best sources of information, and that best source to me would have been the Guatemalan people. And I think you have to sacrifice perhaps a little bit, even if it means just a few seconds. Look, we've had 60 Minutes pieces that were far longer than this one. And they clearly were in a position to get that information from Guatemalans. They were surrounded by Guatemalans for days.
And to get in an authentic voice, to coin a phrase.
Well, I do think the issue is that as the country increasingly changes and we have more Spanish speakers or people who come from different Asian ethnic backgrounds, different languages, what do? Do we not cover them because they don't speak English perfectly? I mean, are we supposed to just exclude them from our storytelling? I think that's a good lesson, and it really raises a very good discussion for our students. What do you do when you are confronted in a situation like this and you have to pull a story together and you may not know the language or have anybody who can interpret it for you?
The book also makes a point of mentioning that the interview with Gutierrez's adopted family reveals some middle-class scenery.
Oh, absolutely.
Why raise that?
That he went into a middle-class area. I think because it showed the differences from where he came and what he was able to do, and it also portrays for the American public who was really upset about immigration today. Here was an immigrant family who was making it in Los Angeles, who lived a middle-class life and took in this young boy. So again, it goes against the stereotype of what is an immigrant and who is an immigrant in America.
Well, we're out of time for tonight. Thank you both very much. You have a website. Is it theauthenticvoice.org?
.org.
For people who want to see more. Thank you again. And that's it for tonight's show. We're here live Wednesday nights at 7:30, and next week we will conclude this series on the best TV reporting on race and ethnicity. And don't forget my daily radio show on WNYC New York Public Radio, weekday mornings at 10. Tomorrow morning, our newspapers going the way of the horse and buggy, and we'll continue to dig into the case of the police shooting in Queens. Tomorrow with New York Times managing editor Jill Abramson on the newspapers and others as well. That's at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Have a great night.